There is no vacation from the argument. No vacation from the argument. Did you hear in the text just now, after God speaking through the prophet is making an appeal to the heavens and the earth, saying, come, listen, my children aren't paying attention. Finally, God does address these wayward children, and God says to them, come, let's argue it out. That's really interesting to me, right? Before he says, I'll make though your sins be as scarlet, I'll make them as white as snow, he says, come, let us argue it out. And I'm thinking about this argument. There is no vacation from the argument. Wherever we go, right, there is this argument. And what is the argument? Do you care or not? Right? Do you care for brokenness, the orphan, the widow, right, the oppressed, or not? If you do, then let's talk about this, right? Let's work this out. If you do care for these elements in our society, there is something of their brokenness, their woundedness inside of you that you need to acknowledge, right? There's some area of woundedness, some hurt that needs to be touched or acknowledged. Come, let's argue this out. Henri Nouwen is a great author and thinker of the past 20th century. And he wrote the book, The Wounded Healer. Has anyone ever heard of this book? The Wounded Healer. It's a remarkable book. And he says, if someone endeavors to heal someone, right, emotionally, psychologically, even physically, but they're not in touch with their own woundedness, right, their own weakness, their own frailty, it will do no good, right? It will come across as patronizing and top-down authoritarianism, right? But if there were ever a wounded healer model, right, for us, it is Jesus of Nazareth, right? Jesus who read scripture passages like I read to you this morning from Isaiah. In fact, Isaiah was one of the first scripture passages that Jesus read in public in the synagogue of Capernaum. And so I've returned. I've returned from my recent trip to the UK with too many images and too many insights to share with you at one point in time, right? It's going to have to be spread out over weeks and months and years. And what's so amazing is that a journey of that distance and that speed would not have been fathomable by most of the Earth's inhabitants. Do you realize that? I mean, to go from London to Seattle, Spokane, is a miracle of technology that would not have been possible in years past. In years past, it would have been slow going, right, to traverse that much time and space. And yet, wherever we went, there was this argument. Wherever we went, there was this argument. No matter what castle we toured, no matter what city we got lost in, no matter what language we were speaking, there was this argument, right? And I remember I said the show right after it happened. We went to the Jane Austen. It wasn't a museum. It was a fashion museum connected with Jane Austen. And Jane Austen had been there. Jane Austen's a famous English author. And she wrote Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice and all these great novels. But they have these assembly rooms in which people would gather to dance, right? And that's the other thing. The community over in the UK was just marvelous. The sense of dance and hospitality connected to dancing and singing was great. But Cheryl did her thing going through that museum, and I went to the bar. So I just needed a break. So I went and I sat down, and I had a drink, and I went outside and I started to write in my journal. And maybe 20 feet from me, there was two twin girls, about 8 years old, right? And they're clearly natives, because they're speaking with this high, elevated accent, or what I regard as to be. So there's a grandmother, grandfather, a mother, and then these two teenage girls, right? One of the girls is very active, jumping around. She's like Bree's age, right? Are you 8? Yeah, cool. So she's jumping around, and she's writing answers to like this puzzle, right? And the other girl is pouring herself cups of tea and drinking down the tea, right? And if you know, this is what they do in England, right? They order these big pots of tea, and then everybody kind of shares in the tea. So this one of the twins is pouring this tea and drinking it down. The other girl is playing around. Until finally the girl that was playing stopped and she said, "Alison has drunken all the tea. Mommy, there is no more tea." And they tried to comfort her and placate her, and she just kind of buried her head in her arms, and she went, "Huh," right? And then she put her head up and she would say, "Greedy, Alison." And the sister was just like, "I'm sorry, I was just drinking tea, And it just reminded me, right? No matter how posh, no matter how beautiful, no matter how elegant, there's this argument going on, right? What are we going to do with our neighbors, right? Our neighbors can be our spouses, our significant others, our sisters, our brothers, our friends. They can be people we meet, the people that we sweat against, on the subway, right? What are we going to do? It seems to me we have this choice, and we can argue it out. We can say, well, let's keep those people at a distance, right? Let's manage those people. Let's not speak to those people, and let's engage in conversation with the people that we like. But wherever we go, even the people that we like, our sister, greedy Alison, right? There's still a problem, right? And it seems like Isaiah is calling this holy nation, right, to account and saying, you, of all the peoples of the earth, you will argue this out, right? You seem to be an insignificant people. I'm going to be your God. You're going to argue this out. So here's the pattern that I've detected in Isaiah and in our recent trip. Ruins, restarts, and hoped-for returns. Ruins, restarts, and hoped-for returns. And these are dynamics that didn't just register on my intellect. I literally felt these movements emotionally and psychologically as I was interacting with folks. I literally, for example, felt the despair of the monks on the Isle of Iona who had built up this majestic place of worship and refreshment, only to see Viking marauders land on the beaches and butcher their bodies and take their tokens, right, for booty. And yet, the history of that place, this monastery on Iona, is one of ruins, restarts, even over centuries, and hoped-for returns. I mean, there we were, right? 563, Columba comes from Ireland, which is the place beyond Rome's reach, right? And he evangelizes Celtic Christianity, right? And there's ruin, and then there's a restart, and then there's hope-for returns. And there we are, centuries and centuries later. Now, while we were there, Cheryl and I didn't live in posh accommodations. We lived in a room that's about twice the size of this table. Maybe a little bit bigger, right? But my bunk bed, right, above Cheryl was about this size, right? And we had laundry, and there was no washer and dryer. We had to wash our hands by hand and let them hang dry. And the weather wasn't too accommodating, right? So I have these stinky white underwears blowing in my face, right, my own, right, as I'm trying to sleep. And Cheryl tells me that I snore. I don't believe her, but there comes a point, right, when you're living in this great place, and no matter how beautiful it is, and you look out and you see the sheep and the rocks and the ocean and everything, and you say, man, this is hard, right? It's hard to live with people, right? I mean, marriage is kind of a microcosm of what in the world, we're about, right? Our neighbor. What are we going to do? Are we going to acknowledge the ruins, right? The brokenness, and then try again? Right? Or not? Let's argue this out. It was the same story in London. Cheryl and I went with our 20-something-year-old boys to witness the performance of Les Mis. Has anyone ever seen that, Les Mis? We saw it once in the States, but on this stage in London, I was profoundly affected. And if you know the story of Les Mis, it's a musical adaptation of Victor Hugo's classic novel by the same name. And the novel describes events in the early 19th century France, and political upheaval, and people's personal lives are ruined, right? There's a young woman named Fantine, right, who has a child, Cosette, right, and she's struggling to make money, right, to support her child, so she turns to prostitution, right? And it's such a tragic thing. And at one point in the musical, she sings this amazing song, and you've heard it, I Dreamed a Dream, right? Just so powerful, right? This was my dream, right? This is what I wanted. This is what I had hoped for, right? And then the tigers come at night, and they rip it all apart. And, just so powerful. And you see that, and you say, I say, that's my life too, right? Maybe not, literally exactly the same, but here's my dream. There it is in ruins, in tatters, right? What do I do, right? Do I acknowledge that ruinedness and start again somehow with God's help? Yes, that's what Fantine does, right? And the other thing about Les Mis that impresses me is they have all these politically motivated, strong young men. You remember the story? And all the young men are like, red, our colors, right? And black, we're fighting for truth and justice, right? And what's right. And they're slaughtered, right? I'm not giving anything away. They're slaughtered. And the point of the story is they build this barricade to stop the slaughter from happening. But at the very end of the film, they ask this question, will you join us? Will you stand on the barricade? Will you fight for a better world? Again, ruins, restarts, hope for returns. So I think that's what Isaiah is all about. And a couple other interesting notes from our trip. We went to Bristol, England, and Bristol is this great seaport, and when we were there, we went to see this film called Dunkirk. Now, pretty powerful, huh? And So Cheryl and I were there amidst all these Brits, and Dunkirk is the story of how in 1940 there were all these troops in France who had to be evacuated across this 20-mile gap of ocean, right? So they could see home, right? But they couldn't get there, and they had to call upon the non-military vessels, right, to come and deliver the troops back home, while the Nazis were just dropping bombs on them all over the place. This is terrible. But there too, it was a powerful moment. And they're saying, there's home. I can see it. There's home. And the guy that plays the naval officer, when he looks out and he sees all the boats coming, he says, "What do you see?" He says, "Home. All right, it's the people. It's the people, like, coming. That's home. Reconciliation out of the ruins, right? Restart."